That's fine, yeah. Thank you very much, Chairman. Minister, good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, I'm just going to set out there how I'm going to approach this session. First of all, I'm going to set out the context for social protection provision. I'm going to look at some key areas of social protection spending. To focus on the unemployment of the 80s, how we addressed it. I'm going to look at the Danish model of flexi-security and see what lessons that has for us here. And then finally look at what should be the priorities for the approach now to unemployment. Now, in current circumstances where there's an economic crisis, there's always a danger of old attitudes coming back within society. In my view, the essential thing is to protect the most vulnerable in society. But I think it's useful to remind us what attitudes were under the poor law system. And just to give you a quote from an English philanthropy organisation back in 1881, there can be no doubt that the poverty of the working class of England is due not to their circumstances, which is more favourable than any of those of any other working population in Europe, but to their improvident habits and thriftlessness. If they are ever to be more prosperous, it must be through self-denial and forethought. Now, that was the poor law mentality, the concept of the deserving and undeserving poor, the deserving that would be organised, looked after by philanthropy, the undeserving poor sent to the workhouses where families were often broken up. It was seen, poverty and unemployment, or want of work as it was called, was seen as part of the individual's defective character. And that only began to change after the Second World War, when first of all the Beveridge report on social insurance and allied services of 1942 was implemented by the post-war Labour government. We then had the UN Declaration on Human Rights in 1948, which had important new social and economic rights. Article 22 on right to social security, Article 23 on the right to work and the right to protection against unemployment. So those attitudes changed fundamentally there with the Beveridge report. Again, in 1980s Britain, some of the poor law mentality began to come back again. Norman Tebbett's famous phrase, on your bike, as advice to the unemployed. Now, what I'm saying today is, in focusing on the unemployed, I think the Beveridge settlement, the Beveridge model that we still have, by adapting it, right, and making it more effective, is still the approach we need to take in terms of tackling unemployment. And don't forget, I mean, the core principles of the Beveridge models were, first of all, that you had for insurance contributions, you had unemployment benefit as a flat rate benefit. The idea that work must always pay was crucial to the Beveridge model. And it's still important and fundamental today. And the way Beveridge approached that was by ensuring, through children's allowances, that were paid whether you were in employment or unemployed, that was part of the system of making sure that it was always more advantageous economically to be in work. And finally, part of the contract was that if you were offered a job or offered training opportunities, you had to take them. That was conditional in terms of that approach. Just to look at some of the social protection spending that we have today, job seekers' allowances and benefits are about 4 billion, which is about 20% of the total. Pensions are obviously a big part of the total. That's likely to grow in future years. We still have a young population here, relatively in European terms. Quite a big payment for one-parent family allowance. Child benefit quite big, obviously, and illness, injury and disability quite significant. Maternity benefit, not hugely significant, but it's probably the only area where we actually are above the European average in terms of maternity benefit. Now, if you look at it overall, social spending, and that includes health and some housing spending, but social spending in Ireland is not large by European standards. NESC calculates, this is a 2005 developmental welfare report from NESC, and they use a purchasing power standard in their calculation. But Ireland, for example, was spending 3,875 units of purchasing power standard per capita whereas Denmark was spending 7,805. So we're not high by European standards by any manner of means. Unemployment benefits, as I say, are now 19% of the total, and it has increased dramatically over the past number of years. Benefit recipiency rates, or dependency rates as the OECD tends to call them, again are not high by European standards. As a percentage of the working age population, they're about 20%. Now that would have increased, obviously. This is a 2005 report, so that would have increased with the level of unemployment going up in the last 3 years. Against that, the population has actually risen fairly significantly. I don't have a precise figure for 2010 or 2011, but I suspect it's not hugely different. But the interesting thing about that is that back in the 1980s, when it was 12% of spending, that is the number of percentage of people of working age receiving a benefit from the Department of Social Welfare as it then was. When it was 12%, it went up to around 19–20% as unemployment increased in the 80s. However, as unemployment went down in the 90s and into 2000, the proportion didn't go down, because it was replaced effectively by spending on one-parent family allowance and spending on disability allowance. That's possibly an area that, in future may be looked at. What I want to do today is concentrate in relation to the unemployed and unemployment. And I will make this point. I think the social cohesion that we've had throughout this crisis is partly due to the fairly reasonable measure of consensus we have in relation to spending on social protection. We didn't have the riots in Greece. Yes, we had disputes in the public sector. Yes, we had difficulties, but not on a scale we've seen in countries such as Greece. And I think, in terms of our response to this crisis and our response in relation to social protection and the unemployed in particular, we need to bear that in mind. Now, I'll argue there's no doubt that we're in an IMF programme. We're not masters of our own destiny. Choices will have to be made. It is going to be difficult. Expenditure cuts are inevitable. There's no doubt about that in terms of the IMF programme. I'm not going to argue that somehow we can get out from under that. That's not the reality of where we're at. I would argue that we have to be a bit more grown up in relation to taxation and issues around that, and ultimately there'll be choices to be made for government. But I'll certainly argue that insofar as the unemployed, be it young workers who never thought they'd see unemployment in this country, or workers generally who thought, well, we've sorted the emigration unemployment in this country. I mean, the shock of the past 2.5–3 years is absolutely extraordinary and fundamental in terms of those people who have now found themselves unemployed. 300,000 jobs lost in this economy in the last couple of years. And the one argument I will make is that whatever needs to be done, whatever ultimately the government decisions have to make, and I don't envy them their task, I have to say, that the focus should not be on the unemployed. They, in my view, should be the priority in terms of the trauma and the difficulties that they have been put in because of economic mismanagement in this country. So I think that's one of the essential points I want to make in terms of this, this presentation. Just very quickly, how we dealt with it in the 1980s. I mean, or the 1990s rather, the 1980s level of unemployment that built up was dealt with over time relatively successfully. And I say that advisedly, not having experienced unemployment myself. But in terms of the reports that I've looked at it, and NESC in particular, I think the conclusion is that it was dealt with. It took time, but it was relatively successful in alleviating the worst impact of unemployment. And Philip could well be right in terms of social schemes, in terms of effectiveness and all of that, but they did help to give people a connection. They did help to give people a purpose. They did help to keep people connected within their local communities. And I don't think we should necessarily decry that. Poverty traps, you've often heard of them in terms of people not having an incentive to take up a job. But by and large, they were successfully eliminated. I'm not saying there are not some of them there. The Nest said that there is a danger of them creeping back in. But again, in terms of child dependency allowances being frozen and child benefit increased, in terms of FISC being put on net income rather than gross income, in terms of back-to-work schemes that allowed people to have their unemployment benefit phased out and tapered out, in terms of retention of secondary benefits, by and large, the poverty traps were more or less tackled. A vast structure was put in place of area-based partnerships, local employment services to particularly focus on disadvantaged areas. And as I say, the general consensus is that over time it was relatively successful, particularly in mitigating the worst impact of unemployed on disadvantaged communities. Now, the evidence is there that the unemployed take jobs when they're available. But having said that, Congress did conclude in a recent, that's the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, right, in a recent report that insofar as in some disadvantaged communities schemes were kept going and retained even though jobs were available at that time, Congress has questioned whether that was doing favours to the long-term unemployed and disadvantaged in those circumstances. Now, as against that, the people in my own union who work in FOSS and are on the frontline service would say to me, well, look, there are times when people are not, as they call it, job ready, and it isn't just a case of offering someone a job. They have to have the confidence as well as the skills in terms of being able to actually function in the labour market. Okay, I just want to look at the Danish model and see what lessons, if any, are there for us. And briefly, the Danish model is as follows. It has what's called weak employment protection legislation. That is, in terms of notification to someone that they've lost their job, by European standards, the level of notification in Denmark, right, is lower. Now, it's not any lower than Ireland, I have to say. It's actually higher. So it's not that we, in comparable terms, we would be judged also to have weak employment protection legislation. The benefits are very, very generous, up to 90% in terms of lower paid workers, and for what they call the average production worker, the income protection for unemployment is around about 70%. So it is much higher than is the case in this country. They effectively have what would be called mandatory active labour market programmes, so that in essence you're on, once you become unemployed, the trade-off for the payment is that within certain periods of time you're offered, whether it's training, education, work placement, whatever, and effectively you have to take it. That's part of the deal in terms of the actual programme. Now again, expenditure in, as I say, in Denmark is much higher. Again, the NESC report using what they call PPS, Purchasing Power Standard. Denmark around 33,000, Ireland 17. So we're much lower than Denmark, but you can see we're significantly ahead of the UK. These are around 2005 figures that NESC prepared from Eurostat. Another feature of the Danish model is what they call job rotation and paid leave schemes, whereby effectively people who are unemployed can replace people who are going on early retirement for the equivalent payment that the unemployed get, sabbatical leave for education purposes for the equivalent payment that the unemployed get, or leave for caring responsibilities. And that's quite significant. Denmark's labour market is about 2,800,000, so it's higher than ours. They have about 800,000 employed in the public sector. Would that we ever had that? We have about 350 and going minus at a rate of knots. So it's a very different structure and a very different economy. But in terms of active labour market job rotation schemes, they're quite significant, over 100,000, and they're certainly been a part of the success of the Danish model for Denmark. Now, having said that, in my judgment, the Danish model is very specific to Denmark. It's not easily transferable to other countries, and it's certainly not easily transferable to Ireland. They have much higher rates of taxation. Total taxation, including social security contributions, is 49% of GDP. Whatever way we count between GDP here, we'd be sort of in the mid-30s compared to that. So it's an entirely different situation in Denmark, and frankly, while in the trade union movement we do aspire to the Scandinavian model, we do extol its virtues, the reality is that culturally we're not going to pay those levels of tax anytime soon, and there's no point in me saying we should adapt the Danish scheme wholesale, because it just is not going to happen. That's not to say that there aren't aspects of the Danish model that we could look at, and in my view, we could look at more targeted active labour market programmes. That is beginning to happen, I think, and I'll talk a bit, and I'm sure the Minister will talk about that as well. And I believe we could look at the Danish Leave job rotation schemes to see to what extent they could be adapted to our circumstances here. So what are the priorities? Well, in my view, there has to be a twin approach. We've got to get back to creating jobs. I mean, 3 times in my lifetime we've had mass emigration and mass unemployment. 50s, 80s and now again, certainly mass unemployment. The immigration maybe hasn't happened yet, but it will if we don't get to tackle the problem. The indigenous sector has got to be a bigger focus of the future in terms of our job creation. Interesting to see what the Minister for Agriculture had to say about that. I would very much agree with him in terms of what potential is there. We just have to get to a situation where we can be a normal economy and normal society, whether it's like Austria, Netherlands, Denmark, some, and they don't all have the Danish levels of tax, but they've managed to actually make a much greater success of their economic model in terms of job creation that we have. So that's part of it. The other is, the evidence from Denmark is that active labour market policies can reduce the level of unemployment. They can actually work in terms of reducing unemployment. That seems to be the evidence from the Danish experience. So our priority, in my view, has got to be to focus on the unemployed, to focus on getting them back to work through whatever needs to be done in terms of education, in terms of training, in terms of work placement programmes and social employment schemes if that's what it takes. They may not be cost effective as others, but they still have a value in my view. We're not masters of our own destiny, I recognise that, so I'm not saying here today, look, the Minister can renegotiate with the IMF. That's not possible. We have to complete the programme, and hopefully at the other end of it we're going to be able to grow this economy again. Philip has touched on this, so I'm not going to say much about it, but when you look at the live register flows, they are significant. Last year, 557,000 people came onto the live register in terms of new registrations. 544,000 went off it. So the actual flows in the register are very, very significant. So it's not the same cohort of people all the time. But the danger, I think, as Philip pointed out, is we could very quickly arrive at a situation of very high levels of long-term unemployed if we don't manage to tackle this problem significantly over the next 1 or 2 years. And we don't want to be in a situation where it takes 10 years to solve the problem, or 10 to 12 years to solve the problem, as it did in the 1980s. Just say a little bit about this now, because I'm sure the Minister is going to cover it, but I know it from the fact that because of the integration of FOSS and part of the HSE and social protection, it obviously involves us on the trade union side in negotiating around how all of that can be brought together. So the new employment and entitlement service of social protection, I believe, is actually a very important new initiative, and it makes sense. I mean, it's a single agency was always the norm in Europe. A better focus on active intervention will arise from it. The stated intention of the Department is to have a case management approach that will allow for individual personal progression plans, so that effectively people will be interviewed as part of the process in terms of claiming their benefit, and they can be offered plans, be it training, be it work placement, or be it educational opportunities. Congress also in 2011 made the point in terms of what Philip has already mentioned, the impact of unemployment on young people coming into the labour market, that we now need to contemplate measures we might not normally do. Traditionally we've had an aversion to compulsion on the unemployed. I think the thinking on that is changing, and the case management approach that the Department is planning will allow that to change. It needs to be a different focus today. It's a much higher educated workforce. We're 5th in the OECD for the 25 to 34-year-old age group. not so much in terms of the older age group, but I suspect, as Philip has pointed out, the unemployed are more in the younger age categories now. So we are looking at a much different category of educated unemployed people. The responses for that reason need to be different. The future economy will be based on higher quality, more innovative products and services. The Hunt report also made the point that we need to foster entrepreneurial imagination, focus on education and enterprise skills. That is going to be the key focus in the future. On the job rotation schemes, I believe we should look at that. I mean, it effectively means that you would look at allowing people leave on the equivalent of unemployment benefit to take up education opportunities, maybe to take up caring opportunities. If you look at the figures, Denmark, 30% of adults in 25 to 64 age group are in education and training. In Ireland, it's only 7%. There is scope, in my view. It's not going to save money, but it would be a potential to get the unemployed into jobs, keep up their job skills, allow other people to leave the labour market temporarily for 2 or 3 years while they're on education perhaps or caring opportunities. We need to explore that, in my view, and I think it will be useful for the department to consider some pilots in that area. I'm not saying it's a cost saving, but it doesn't necessarily be a cost either. I'm not saying either that it's something you could have in the long term, but as a short-term response to the current problem, I think it's worth exploring. So finally then, whatever constraints are there for social protection, and I don't envy the Minister's job in this regard, my view is that the unemployed should be the priority and they should not be the focus of cutbacks. I believe the new integrated case management approach by the Department has the potential to actually make a difference, right, in terms of the situation the unemployed find themselves in, particularly if it's properly designed with clear pathways. And the point I'm making is, yes, if you follow the Danish model, effectively then it's mandatory, not in terms of just telling people you're withdrawing their benefit, but in saying this is the actual programme, this is the option you have, it's an individual plan that each person gets, whether it's education, whether it's training, whether it's work placement programmes. How exactly the new SOLAS organisation, the VECs, are going to integrate into all of that, I don't know, but obviously the integration at local level will be very important. The job rotation, I think, has possibilities in the short term in terms of taking people out of the unemployed bracket and into the labour market temporarily, and a win-win situation all round in terms of improving the educational levels for the employed as well as the unemployed workforce. Given the higher levels of education qualifications among the population today, there needs to be a greater emphasis on entrepreneurial training. You can actually coach and train people to think in entrepreneurial terms and start their own business. Start your own business will be a more important part of it, in my view, than the unemployed who are less well educated in the past. And the SME sector also has to be an important part of the mix. Thank you very much.